Ladies and gentlemen, to avoid slips of the tongue, I have carefully prepared my contribution and questions. But before, I want to thank Professor Pistor for her interesting presentation and, moreover, for the inspiring Code of Capital, how law creates wealth and inequality. Also, my thanks to Joeri Vananroye, who is on the first row, who called Professor Pistor a few months ago and who organized with her and with Professor Vananroye this event. Thanks to you. But back now to the Code of Capital. Professor Pistor, you point to the lawyers and thus to the vast majority of your readers and your tonight attendees as the masters of coding, the masters who code capital and allow capital to rule by law. Doing so, you make them responsible for creating wealth and disturbing inequalities. And taking into account the examples you provide, it is indeed difficult to disagree with you. They do not leave much room for discussions. Lawyers indeed are masters of coding of capital, but are they the masters of coding? To be honest, and frankly speaking, enjoying that privilege, I doubt that lawyers are able to code capital on their own. It should, for instance, come as a surprise that collateral debt obligations or credit default swaps were coded. The guess is that it were orthodox economists and financial wizards who cleared the job, and afterwards passed the toxic financial instruments to the lawyers who didn't understand them for trading purposes or when they gave them headaches. In a way, however, the intervention of economists and financial experts may excuse the lawyers of my and also your generation for what they did over the last 45 or 50 years and still do. They are indeed in the business of coding capital, of creating ever more wealth and disturbing inequality, causing overexploitation and mishandling of our planet, climate change, decrease of biodiversity, and other ecological disorders, not to forget mass disillusion about democracy and its promises. But the lawyers were and are not alone. Economists, financial experts, and politicians of all kinds were and are part of the gang. The point may be important when we start thinking about ways to change the actual coding of capital. In your book, you call it the rollback strategies. In your presentation of tonight, the specific reform proposals. You propose reforms, rollbacks, at a pure legal level. You recognize, however, that the chances of success of your proposals are uneven and uncertain. It will take lots of time to undo what has been coded as capital by law. Does humankind, however, still have the required time to unwind that coding. Since economists and finance experts are determining the coding of capital by law, it may be a more efficient and shorter path to change the prevailing economic neoliberal model that economists and financial experts have developed over the last 2 centuries. We as lawyers are unable to do so, but we don't have to start from scratch. What you as a lawyer, Professor Pistor, did in your book with law was also done by economists and financial experts in recent years. They pointed to the economic and financial coding of capital. They explained how economics and finance create wealth and inequality, and they propose also changes in the economic neoliberal model. Amongst others, Keith Raworth, Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, and in French, Thomas Porcher, Traité d'économie hérétique, En finir avec le discours dominant, and Patrick Artus, Discipliner la finance, and of course also Thomas Piketty's astonishing et idéologie. Their specific economic reform proposals not only can be translated by legislators, but also coded by lawyers within the framework of the public policy exception that you have mentioned on your slides, and as appearing in the New York Arbitration Convention. And, in my opinion, more in general and more interesting, that limit also the constitutional and human rights of everybody, also of the affluent and the most affluent. I'll be happy to learn from your comments. Thank you.
Perhaps I look at Vice Prime Minister to see what now, perhaps you wish and at the end.
Dear Professor Pistor, I want to thank you first for taking care in such a wonderful way of my Sunday. I had, despite the difficult situation wherein my country finds itself, I had a marvelous Sunday. And imagine that some months ago, I had a similar experience with the young man who spoke just before me, Ludo Cornelis, who wrote a wonderful book as well about public order. And these are feasts for the spirit, and it is the spirit that keeps us going. Your book makes me think of something I read, and not only in his book, but in one of his books, at least Richard Posner, in The Failure of Capitalism, where he said, individually we behave very rational, and collectively we behave very irrational. Our collectivity has enlarged in the last 50 years at a remarkable speed, and let's say that it has become even more difficult to behave collectively rational than it has ever been before. And therefore, the guilt and the responsibility question that was underlined so eloquently by Ludo Cornelis will not be my main concern. We all do what we think we have to do in this difficult world at our place, and by piecemeal engineering we try to do some good and to have some fun. Your book nonetheless is provoking and a little bit provocative, certainly at the end, where you, in the last sentence, and you will say he'd only read the conclusion as all ministers. It's not true. Where in the last sentence you say it may be social disorder that will again make power almighty and the law, as always at the end of such a period, less important, not to say irrelevant. It looks a little bit as if you're telling us that the root of law, because it's there that you mention it very clearly, is replaced somehow, because capital rules by law, I understood that, by the rule of capital. I only make some remarks in order to help us further, because as a politician in the first place now, we always look for solutions. The first is, private law is much more international than public law, which is something what we would never have thought. The choice of law and the fact that countries in general recognize the law of the other states make that private law is basically international private law, but in more international private law, it's also private international law. And somehow, not really absent, but at the background of your book, there are two actors and kinds of actors that are barely named, but that are most co-responsible, that are the financial markets, and that are the central banks. Two circles that are generally named in that context, the financial markets and the central banks, and that's it. The rest, they're anonymous, they're extremely absent and extremely present at the same time, but a lot of the engineering you describe is validated or even created by these instances. Choice of law indeed is a very liberal criteria, and as a corporate lawyer, I will not go into the comparison you make between the Lehman Brothers structure and a large African family, but I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Choice of law is an extremely liberal criterion, and it made us to what we are. But when I hear you speak about the nation state, and when I hear you say that some domestic elements might nonetheless serve, I hear a certain longing for a far past. When in 1960, the most of us were much younger than today, and many of us had not been born, there was a big introduction in Brussels of the law firms you spoke of. Because the European Union was born in 1957, and from 1960 on, they came. If you won't tell it to third parties, is the press present? Be silent, I beg you. And therefore, lawyers in Belgium got well paid. Because they were very well paid in Anglo-Saxon countries, or in Anglo-American countries. And we inherited the culture that we were all more or less educated in, if we really wanted to, and that was to become dominant for the years to come. Because the European Union was one of those, the common market it was at the time, where Britain wasn't even a member of, was one of those mechanisms of globalization ahead of us. Now, the thing is, how do you avoid that? How on earth do you avoid that such structures get born in the world of today? Because beside law and economics, and I get back to that issue, there is technology. There is one big responsible for everything that happens today. It's not the family of economists nor that of lawyers. It's that of biotechnologists and of engineers. I apologize for those in the room. They make progress. It's not that they make progress, but they create progress. That's what they're doing. And we are bound to follow. You cannot tell to a child that it cannot phone to his mother for a very low price when that is marketable. And even at 6, it starts doing like that. Human mobility, therefore, is enormous. We start moving. And once we start moving, it's not the baker that moves. It's not the farmer that moves. But the rest of us are on the move. And that makes domestic reactions quite complicated. If a Belgian legislator were to tell that a lot of domestic elements of law were important, the Belgian labor market would not be as well off as it is today. So we have to react collectively, in my view. Because if we react nationally with the nation state, you refer to it, I think we're very poor in power, and we will not take back control. We will not. We will be forgotten. And I agree that it was the City of London that was despised and not the European Union. But unfortunately, all these intellectuals in the room and in London were not capable of convincing the people of that fact. I conclude. Your book is inherently brilliant. It is an analysis and a synthesis I've rarely read in so few words. And for every good student, it should be not only recommended, but obligatory. But at the outset, you cite a man who lived here in Brussels, Karl Marx. And what you actually do is show that the substructure is more important than the superstructure. And whatever the substructure may be, whether it is economic or legal or technological, the substructure dominates what politics can do about all this. Politicians can only recognize what these elements are, and Marx was a genius, absolutely. Now, practically speaking, because the only thing we can do, except educating students, is try to find out how politics and legislators can go better about all these lawyering things you speak about that irritate, that create a lot of fuss, and that make legislators and judges incapable of doing what they have to do. Not creating capital, but creating justice. My answer would be that we have to go much faster, collectively, rationally. That Calvin Coolidge complained himself about short selling. It was somewhere in the beginning of the 30s. We are all complaining day and night about credit default swaps, which is, if the press won't cite me on this, a quite immoral instrument. But it makes financial markets work, that you insure the life of somebody you don't like and that you sell that insurance. It's a wonderful instrument, but I don't think a lawyer alone could have invented it. There I agree with Ludo, as always. But if we don't react collectively as legislators faster to such movements, and we keep on telling for years and years what I'm doing now, that this is quite interesting, but that we should do something about it, it won't work. Collective rationality presupposes, obliges us to, at an international level, think and react very quickly. I don't know how, but I'm not sure that the City of London alone, that the New York State, or that the state of Delaware are capable of doing that alone. If they are, and the common law is capable of doing it, please, that it does, because we on the continent, I'm sorry to make that distinction, are much more historically linked with the state. And I don't speak about Belgium, of course not. I speak about France, I speak about Germany, than with the law as it is seen in Anglo-American countries. And states, internationally and globally speaking, could do something about it. I'm sorry to have been long. It's due to my profession. Thank you very much.
I propose that I make my comments and then Professor Pistor can react collectively. Then we open the floor to questions from the audience. Thank you. Just 2 weeks ago, many of the Belgians here were also in this very same room for a conference on Belgian partnerships. This rudimentary business form hardly changed since Roman times, or I should add, since the Bruges partnership you mentioned in your book, has known a remarkable resurgence in Belgium. Its use perfectly illustrates the legal code of capital. Through the contribution of assets, mere words in an ordinary deed, these assets get durability and universality. A more conventional way of referring to this code, because durability, you make it sound like a good thing, which is of course often is. A more conventional way of referring to this code is entity shielding, vermogensafscheiding, séparation des patrimoines. The assets cannot be seized by the creditors of the heirs or the partners. Partnership creditors have priority, but more often than not, they are absent, and the assets are, for all practical purposes, protected against all creditors. Smart drafting, which is often not present, allows also the technique to give this technique durability, surviving even the insolvency of a partner. This mechanism is very similar to the entail that you mentioned, where you allow through a legal technique, assets to be shielded from creditors. We also had something like the entail on the continent during the feudal times, where because of the mixing up of private and public law rights, it was impossible to seize assets. Napoleon has abolished all these things. If I read your book, I have often come to think, well, that civil code was not that bad, because it did prevent a lot of these capital coding where it thought they would not be to the benefit of society. And as we have come, I think, over the years, we have allowed more asset partitioning, we have allowed trust-like figures. It's probably not because they're inherently better, because they have some superior legal quality, but just because we were under pressure from legal competition. If you look at the trust, first of all, the trust is really an arcane and not very sophisticated technique, and there is really nothing of societal value that you can do with a trust that you can't do with a legal person. So back to the partnership, like the entail, it allows to protect assets against the auction block, and is probably a reason why people who have this protection are better off than other people. They protect these assets against their creditors, but of course in practice only one creditor really matters, the tax authorities. This is eminently so with the Belgian estate planning trust. When the pater or mater familias deceases, the rights towards the assets passes to the heirs, but not through the rules of inheritance, but through the rules of partnerships. In practice, that is due. I think it's a nice illustration for the Belgian practice of this coding. The beauty of the book by Professor Pistor is that it connects the everyday nuts and bolts of lawyers with the political economy. These arcane and technical rules, and I think that it's often crucial that they are arcane and technical, allow a technical group to put assets on steroids, as you say, to give them an advantage, and they erode, by eroding the tax base, they impair the possibility for the democratic polity to govern itself. It is a recurring theme at every graduation speech of R or every law school that a moving speaker talks to a wet-eyed audience about the importance of the rule of law as the protection of the weaker against the stronger. Yet in practice, many graduates use the law for private parties to advance their private interests. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that as a rule. A deal makes both parties better off and increases welfare in society. Yet, as the example of the partnership demonstrates, many deals and legal structures, are ill understood through the merely contractual lens. The bread and butter of any lawyer consists of many techniques with erga omnes effect. They are binding upon third parties, even unwilling third parties, and rather than create a cooperative surplus, they create negative externalities. This is a way of talking about property rights that should resonate with lawyers. When a lawyer reads the economic literature about property rights, he will often be puzzled by the celestial nature of the discussion, which often overlooks the basic legal feature such as the erga omnes effect of property rights. Yet, the analysis will also open eyes for many lawyers. Obviously, there is the insight in the societal effects of what lawyers do. If I have one critique, which was also shared by previous speakers, is that you speak about the lawyers as the masters of the code. It suggests they are masterminds, whereas they are probably merely the hired gun that doesn't pull the trigger. After reading your book, lawyers will at least have the Faustian dignity of selling their soul en pleine connaissance de cause. Perhaps more important is that your work casts a suspicion on the neutrality, you could even say the political virginity of property rights and other concepts of private law such as collateral. Lawyers have always had a need for transcendency, grounding their rules in some higher realm. In the 12th century, Roman law was the ratio scripta. Later, natural law was invented. And these days, human rights and efficiency compete for the prime spot. Yet property rights seemed always to have maintained an undisputed spot, unlike other types of legal regulation. I think it's an evergreen of the traditional economic analysis of law that those concepts are somewhat presented as eternal principles embodying efficiency. I even think that the young Posner, I don't mean Eric Posner, but Richard Posner when he was young, even has written that's rather bold claim on paper, like common law, that's the embodiment of what has been efficient, that's not a product of some political decisions, whereas regulations have always been met with suspicion. Regulation has always been thought of as something. Well, after your book, a similar suspicion is raised against the techniques of private law. I have some points I wanted to raise with you. I will do it so briefly. One is the regulatory competition. Personally, I think that the biggest problem we have, the biggest legal problem, which causes many other problems, is competition. You can choose your law. Law has the vocation to be binding. If you can choose your law, is it still law? That regulatory competition you have mentioned as an example, the regulatory competition in company law. As you mentioned, the case law of the European Court allowed member states to choose their applicable company law. It's described as corporate mobility or transfer of seat, but I think that obfuscates the fact that it boils down at the end to a freedom to choose your applicable company law. Hence, it should come as no surprise that in Belgium, but also in many other countries, company law has become more shareholder friendly, less creditor friendly. But what to do about it? If one member state wants to impose a rule to protect other stakeholders, suppose to increase directors' liability, as an example, any company can choose another applicable company law to escape that new rule. You only need one company using that freedom of movement, as it is called, one company to escape that rule. The only way to prevent that, or to have some rule that would prevent this, is European legislation, which would require often a qualified majority, and for the thing that really matters, tax law, a unanimity. So how do we solve this in the European context? I don't see a solution, and then I'm not even considering the fact that maybe if the two centers are outside of the European Union soon, maybe that's not even relevant. So how can we organize this with the institutions which we have? Of course, in the real world, we cannot start with a blank slate. A last question, perhaps, or a comment you might want to comment on, is law and economics. Piketty has already been mentioned. He tells that there has been an ideology in the last, especially the last 20, 40 years, justifying inequality and using the law to bring this inequality about, or to maintaining it. Now, if there has been such an inequality, the high priests of that, if there has been such an ideology, the high priests of this ideology has often been members of the law and economics movement. Do you see this change? And if change will law and economics be the last resort of that ideology? Or perhaps it might be the case, as it is with you, that in law schools will be the places where a new way of thinking about economics will start. So these are a few of the questions. I propose that you reply to the questions which you like.
Thank you very much. Okay. Well, thank you very much for these very insightful comments. Let me answer some of them, and I think all three commentators had something to say about the lawyers. In the book, I give this wonderful quote by Lord Campbell, who in the late 19th century was trying again to reform the law of realty in England, which they had been trying to do since the 1830s, and before the big crisis of the 1870s it wasn't possible because of the entrenched interest of the landlords. But sort of closer in the 1870s, when he failed again to push to his fellow lords, your lordships, there is an estate in this realm that is more powerful than you and me, and that these are the country's solicitors. Why is that so? I think what I want to say, yes, lawyers don't do it alone. I don't think that the econ professors really knew what these folks were doing. Some did, most of them in business schools, and Merton and others who sort of set up their own long-term management capital fund before they crashed with them, they had an idea what they were doing. Mostly these are practitioners. The clients know what they want. The lawyers package it in. But you can substitute the clients, you cannot substitute the lawyers, right? This can be landlords yesterday, these are financial asset holders today, but without the lawyers knowing the laws and increasingly knowing a set of different laws and regulations in different jurisdictions, you cannot possibly do that. So I'm not saying that the lawyers are actively out there and pushing it, and that they always try to claim that they're in the packaging industry. I want to say they're just too smart to get away with that. I think lawyers have more agency. There might be an incentive structures in the way they're being paid and promoted in law firms today that they have no option. But then we should recognize that. But they know, I think, what they're doing. So I don't want to sort of backtrack on that. Should we do this rather through political means? Ideally, yes. If we had the collective political will to change these things, we could try that. But I also want to add something that I learned from lawyers that I talked to in New York. It doesn't take much time for lawyers to learn how to get around a new public regulation that we have put in place. That is the ever sort of repeating game that I'm describing to some extent in the book. So if you have a legislative reform, you're trying to curb certain excesses, and the lawyers use the same kind of tools. It's always the same modules of the Code of Capital to get around what you have just put in place. I would argue if we just leave the things in place as we currently have them, even a very well-meaning and very effective public intervention will only go half the way. This is why I'm suggesting we have to take the toolbox away. So my interventions might sound very incremental, but it's basically saying we just take away some of the excessive use of what you're doing. I'm not saying everything, maybe I'm not radical enough for that, but I'm not saying everything, but I think some of that. And in effect, I'm basically saying we will not guarantee you full legal predictability and certainty. We're just taking away the punch ball. This is, if you choose to do this coding strategies, it's not clear that you will be able to enforce it. There will be a court that some weaker party can appeal to and can invoke other principles, and we will challenge. And that is true for private arbitration, that is true for other things as well. This is, I think, how we can do in a more decentralized fashion, begin change without the political will that we currently have. And we need this change even if we had the political will, because without that, we will just have, they're just going to run an end game around us again. So I think the clients are really critical. I don't want to sort of distract from them entirely, but I also wanted to give more agency to the lawyers than they had. The point about whether I'm longing for a past that is gone, I don't want to put myself into the shoes of my dear colleague in Germany, Wolfgang Streeck. I don't have that romantic view of the 1970s, quite frankly. I'm also a woman, and so I don't have, I like to live in the days that we have today. But what I want to recognize is that the political institutions for collective governance that we have still are at the nation states. We can't, I mean, the EU, it takes even longer. I admire the efforts that have been done. Not all of them work, but some has been achieved. Everywhere else in the world, it's less than that. It's typically at the nation states, and I think we have to recognize that. And I think so the point that you made is really critical. Private law is much more international than public law. If that is so, how do we tame the private law? And I think we have to use some of the private law mechanism. Ideally, of course, if you could get change in England or the United States, that's where we start. But these legal systems and their interest groups benefit most from the system that we have. So I don't put my emphasis there. I don't think that these are the countries where we'll see the change. I think others have to push back as well. So we can't just look at them. And then lastly, coming to Joeri's comments, one, I think you picked up on something that a colleague now at Columbia who used to be in Amsterdam, Giuseppe Dari Mattiacci, an expert also among others in Roman law, said in commenting on my book. He said, what you're basically saying is that we have to police better the numerous clauses, the dividing line between what is property and what is contract. So yes, choose your contracts, but don't try to create property rights. Don't mess with that line. This is basically the enumeration principle or the numerous clauses principle, that there's basically the state or the collective standing behind and identifying the interests that deserve that kind of protection. And that's, I think, a good way of doing that, of putting that. And then maybe I'm just going to say a word about law and economics. So when I moved from Germany to the United States, just a little bit of the land of freedom, I have to say. I come from a very doctrinal legal system. I was trained in it, both sort of basic training, and I did my referendariat, the practical training as well. And I'd always be interested in understanding the institutions of society, and law as an institution and how it interacts with economic institutions and economic systems in society. So using social science approaches to law is something that we should do. But I do agree also with your point, Joeri, that some of the ideology that creeped in pushed us to ignore certain phenomena, and I think we just have to come back to that. And I also think that many of the lawyers in the law and economics tradition just embraced too much a relatively simplistic notion of economic analysis and forgot the complexities and the power of law. And that's what I want to bring in. That's why I wrote this book. So thank you for these wonderful comments, and I'm looking very much forward to your questions. Will you do moderation? Yeah.
I will.
Shall I? Sit or stand?
Okay, if you sit.
Okay.
I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. I hope so.
My name is Max P. I'm a postdoc at Vananroye in Brussels. This question is like once more to brief once more, and it's pushing you again on whether the roadmap strategy will be fixed. But from a principle perspective. So, as we heard earlier, it's not just the lawyers who were behind the legal coding that you described, it's also politicians, it's also financiers, it's all ecosystem. So, if you could push through the changes that you described, wouldn't the same kind of ecosystem that undermined an earlier, more restrictive legal setup, wouldn't the same deeper forces, the same ecosystem, roll out the changes that you are asking that you described in the roadmap strategy?
Yeah. Do you want me to respond directly? Does this work? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So thanks for the question. I hope this works. At least the light is on. I think you have a good point, because ultimately this is, of course, closely related to power structures that we have. But I think part of my argument is also that the lawyers are participants in the creation and entrenchment of these power structures. And in that sense, the strategic interventions that I'm trying to suggest is to give less power and to destabilize the system such that the automatic recreation of what we had before is not that easy. I can't deny this wouldn't happen again. I mean, I've seen this just over 4 centuries when I did my research. It's coming back time and again. But I would also point to periods when it was not as excessive as it has been today. And it's typically when you limit options to some extent, and when you create greater responsibilities and force the clients as well to internalize some of the costs of what they're doing, that you can get a more balanced perspective on how law is used to code capital. So I think what we ultimately would need is a set of meta rules and greater clarity of norms, so we can also identify when things get out of hand and find strategies to push back. The specific strategies, I think, have to respond to the particular ways in which law was mobilized again to code capital, that it has to adapt to that, and that never works entirely without political economy. I would grant you that as well.
Before giving the microphone to Professor Ludo, I want to mention that the book is on sale at the end of the presentation. Waterstones is present to sell the book, and I think the normal price is €35, and they will sell it here for €28. So it's a unique opportunity to buy the book. Publisher Vicentia is also here to sell a new book of Professor Cornelis and his 90 other books. But I'm happy to give the mic to Professor Ludo.
Thank you. My question is whether you think there's any credible role in turning tide in favor of your approach to things, whether there's any role for legal education, and what the position of US law schools in this respect could be. Let me illustrate what I want to say by referring to your example of the securitization operations that contributed in a way to the financial crisis. These operations were underpinned by a whole series of legal opinions issued by reputable lawyers trained at law schools like Columbia, NYU, etc. When I, as an academic, am confronted with these legal opinions, you often ask yourself, how is it possible that very reputable lawyers were prepared to sign off on this? For instance, saying that some securitization vehicles, bankruptcy, remote programs, if you look at it as an academic, immediately you have that. So my question basically is, do you think you and your colleagues at Columbia and other law schools have a role in telling students, your fellows, if you're in practice in a year or two, don't do what your predecessors did, once they were in practice, maybe sign off on legal opinions, which is only just one example, where they should have known that, the content of the opinion was influenced by the pay they received from their client. And do you think, as a law school, particularly in the US, you could credibly make this point when you charge students $60,000 a year, who then, of course, have to make a living at what we did was doing what the client wants them to do? So, is there any credible role for legal education in reforming minds?
Yeah, no, I thought we would go immediately to the fee structure. So there was an article in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago that a law student who comes to Columbia has to cough up $100,000 per year, 65 in fees, and 35 for living in New York times 3. So given that structure, there is no doubt that most of our lawyers or law students will have to go in code capital. There's just nothing that would prevent them from that. And I think sort of we have a tradition. Most of the law schools over the last several decades have increased fees 5% per year, even as inflation rates were much lower than that. And it's clearly not sustainable. We have started to go back to that, but that probably won't be enough either. We now have more programs where students who go into public interest and don't earn the kind of fees or salaries that lawyers in high-powered law firms earn, they can be released of their student loans and the fees that they have to pay through law schools. I think these programs have to be expanded. We're doing some of that. These are still drops on a hot stone. So I mentioned this in the book. I haven't rolled out an entire reform program. What I would say, however, is that our students are also not rebelling yet, but they're asking exactly these kind of questions. And they will, when they find themselves in a certain incentive structures in these firms, I can't blame them for doing what they're doing. What I've been doing for the last couple of years, I've been co-teaching a seminar on law and finance in theory and practice with an attorney who has done securitization over the last 35 years, not so much mortgages, but almost anything else that you can securitize. And we're bringing the students in the firm, and we're discussing with them the role of lawyers, because the lawyers did feel that dilemma, especially during the highly competitive period in the boom years, where a client comes and say, do X, and the lawyer says, I won't do it, and then they go to the next firm. And so you have to ask yourself very clearly about where you draw the line, and I think many realized ex post facto that they hadn't drawn the line where they should have rather, right? And what they usually do, and you can see this in the documentation, not only in the legal opinions, but the risk warnings in prospectuses for all these instruments increased. The lawyers knew. They put these risk warnings in, right? And they were, of course, thereby protecting the back of their client and their own back, but they didn't change the system. And so at the very least, so I'm not changing the system on my own, I think we should have these debates, and one of the reasons why I'm writing this book is that I do think that we should have these debates, and we should think seriously about the role of the lawyers, and we should at least give them the intellectual and conceptual know-how about to reflect about the role that they have in society.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Christina. I'm a visiting professor at UAB, and it's usually such a great role. Professor Pistor, thank you very much for coming. We're my entire class. We can wait.
Oh, hi. Hi, guys. That's great.
One of the things that we cover is, you just mentioned legal modules, which wealth inequality are created. Could you give us some insights on how potential law creates wealth or inequality?
Well, I think, like prudential regulation, where we have bank regulations and we do the risk out.
Or like basically standards, software, for example. How do you capital requirements, how do you contribute to inequalities in our society today?
Yeah, no, So I think, yes, it's a very good question. So I'm focusing on private law, and you're now saying, so what is the contribution of public regulations, prudential regulations that come in? One way you can just look at this is if you look at the risk weighting that we do for different types of assets, that's a way in which we also code capital, in which we certainly open opportunities to find new loopholes and opportunities to go in and create capital assets that have a particular risk profile and therefore allow you to get around regulatory arbitrage. People have argued also that the CDS was in part a response to the Basel requirements, not only for a way sort of to shorten the market. So yes, I think there's this interplay, and that also we have seen time and again. So you do some public regulation, and the lawyers again sort of I think they look at the regulations as scaffolding that necessarily has gaps. No regulation is ever complete, and then try to find new ways to code assets and capital that would fit within the gaps, because it has to be legal. That's a key thing, right? To be credible and to be scalable and to work as a financial asset, it has to be legal. So it has to fit within the constraints that regulation places. But the constraints themselves create certain incentives to go in a particular direction to code capital. Absolutely.
I have disciplinary authentication lecture, and the basic problem, of course, you have simplifying the book, but the basic problem is not so much if by coding, lawyers create wealth. I think the basic problem is that wealth is unequally distributed. That's the real problem. And I think the question is, what do you do about it? And you have really a number of remedies, so to say, which you would think that is advisable. But I think one of the problems of the growing inequality of distribution of income and wealth has to do with the fact that over the last generation, a new number of players has come into the international economy. Let's say before the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was clear that the international economy was dominated in the West, and communist countries did not compete with the West. And there was a kind of consensus about how to organize the international economy. My problem is that now we have new players, very important players, who are in fierce competition with Western economies. And their ideas about inequality are quite different from what we would propose for equal distribution. And therefore, I think that because of this competition, I feel that the remedies are inadequate in the sense that in order to have a result, we should try to get these new economic players also into the game, because otherwise we won't get the result.
Yeah, thank you. I think you can understand the remedies only if you buy the argument, which I guess you're not buying, which is the argument is that wealth is created in law. So you're saying what first came wealth and then law is used so the wealthy can hire the better lawyers as guns to create even more wealth. And my argument is actually that enormous amounts of wealth are created in law. And I think the sort of incremental or radical incrementalism that I'm suggesting makes only sense if we recognize the importance of law itself in wealth generation. I would also say that we see that also in countries like China today. China has a pretty booming shadow banking system, and I think many of the techniques that they have imported, they came from outside China. That's not something that they learned in Maoist China, which also creates instability. I think we have to come to terms with the fact that a lot of the competition globally for coding capital actually comes from our countries. The US was at the heart of the storm of the financial crisis, and it also has become one of the most unequal societies, even though it was one of the most equal at the beginning of the 20th century. So I think there are societies in the Middle East or so where inequality is more tolerated, but China was much less equal just 2 or 3 decades ago, and I think it also has become as unequal as it is today, in part because it has adopted many of the techniques from the West rather than the other way around. But these are judgment calls, and reasonable people can disagree on that.
Thank you very much. I am a chief industrial organization economist. but once upon a time I asked dean of a prestigious law faculty in this country, the faculty, also, why do we have courts, why do we have laws? They all told me, well, Patrick, if you seek justice, you will know where to find it. Now, is your claim that there is too many players in the market? Because that is an old key in industrial organization. Research markets. The more players not necessarily means more quality, lower prices. So if I hear you, I get the idea that maybe a simple regulation on entry of law firms could already do some investment. And I'm not even talking about transaction costs now, because the protagonist of transaction costs is sitting 3 meters from me here. So let's keep it on survey.
I think there's, of course, a point that if you have a lot of competition amongst lawyers, then lawyers will do things that they might otherwise not do. But I think the issue goes further, and it goes to the point that I made at the beginning of my talk when I said many of the assets that we use today as the major source of capital, intellectual property rights and financial assets in particular, are themselves creatures of the law. So this self-referential quality of the kind of capital that we're creating, I think, fuels a demand for lawyers that we would otherwise not have. And we can try to cabin it artificially. I'm not sure how effective this would be, but I think we should recognize that too. It's the material from which, law is the cloth from which capital is cut. It's that material, and of course it draws a lot of lawyers into the profession who can then use this material to create even more wealth for their clients. So I think we've sort of reached the stage where you dislodge the legal profession from sort of simple assets such as land, even firms, and leave them with assets that they can create themselves. That just creates a huge demand for the profession.
Perhaps 2 very brief last questions and then we wrap up.
Thank you. So I do my best. I'm assistant professor at Utrecht University. Thank you very much for a great presentation and great book and for the comments. I just wanted to make a remark because there are lots of talk here about transactional lawyers and lawyers working for law firms as the main eagles, so to speak, or even thinking maybe it's not us lawyers. But I think, and I wanted just to make a suggestion that the problem is deeper. So if you think even of courts, which were given as a part, so giving more power, more control to courts and the remedies, a number of legal devices that you described were actually confirmed by the courts, including, for instance, if we talk of rules of incorporation in the EU, the European Court of Justice. So my question is, perhaps we should think more deeply about the type of discussions that we engage in, and perhaps part of the problem is that we do not properly understand the consequences of what we are doing as lawyers, on whichever side we are, and also who is involved ultimately in the conversation. Is it only lawyers, or is it more accessible? Because who ultimately discusses what happens in courtroom perhaps has consequences for how acceptable those solutions are. Thank you.
Yeah. You want to group them? Okay.
For the last
The pleasure of doing Professor Veranansi taught me law and economics here. I want to bring the attention to a couple of things. I don't know how many of you know about Leonard Lessius. Well, Leonard Lessius was a superstar theologian of his day, and he's had an immense impact on financial markets, because he essentially said that a letter of interest was fine, whereas previously it was banned by the Christian church. Now, coming back to, given that Professor Pistor is at Columbia, we should remember that not so long ago in the United States, company profits and interest on bank loans were treated accounting-wise the same. Now, this brings me back to my main point, which was something which Julian said. Quis custodies, ipsos custodiet, who will guard the providence themselves? My submission to you, Professor Pistor, is that laws are man-made, and what we need to ensure are the virtues of the people voting the laws. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both questions. Let me answer them in turn. So Agnieszka, actually nice to see you. To your question, I think you're right that many of the institutions had to be confirmed by courts to have the legal validity. And that's again, so I think for building the system that we have, that we call capitalism, that was critical. The common law and sort of the willingness of judges to throw their weight behind a particular side. And they have developed a very pro-business reputation. There's also studies about the chancery courts in the 18th century why they sided with the landed elites against the creditors. So there's a socioeconomic story that one can tell as well. But I want to add one point. It goes back to another comment that was made earlier. I think the legal profession today has increasingly distanced itself from the courts. And one of the scariest things for some of the coders of capital is to actually find themselves in a common law court in particular, because a single precedent could destroy thousands, if not millions, of outstanding contracts that were coded in the same way. That's why we see the proliferation of these legal opinions, where law firms are writing legal opinions that tell their clients what is legal, and those that some have shared with me cite decisions that sometimes are 10 years old or older, because these cases no longer go to court. The lawyers will do everything to prevent them from going to court. They into arbitration to avoid a potential precedent. And they also argue typically that the judges don't know what they're doing, but they can't know what they're doing because they don't see these cases anymore. So we're finding ourselves in a world where we're increasingly distancing ourselves from judges and courts. It doesn't mean that they don't do these things, but I think we have to look at these two sides. On interest rates and accounting rules, yes, I mean, it's a very interesting story. When you look at the usury rules and the anti-usury rules, that's one of, in addition to taxes, trying to get around usury rules was one of the issues how the lawyers have honed their skills over the years, how to get around regulations. And I'm not saying, therefore, we shouldn't think about some of these constraints, but we should also realize that these attempts to, cabin capital and in some ways have not been effective necessarily over time. But this comes back also to yours earlier point. Accounting rules are a big area that I don't really discuss in the book, and that sort of deserves a separate treatment as well. So I appreciate that comment.
Thank you. I would like to thank Professor Pistor for coming again to Leuven. It was in Brussels 2 years ago. We witnessed the making of the book, and we were delighted to see it presented today as a full-grown baby. I would also like to thank Professor Heermans for his continued support to law and economics in Belgium, and Professor Cornelis and Minister Geens for their interventions. I would also like to thank the deans of the campus in Brussels for hospitality, Mr. Ida Akkermans for tailoring the event, and Ms. Nijs for practical arrangements. If I understand well, she also has a token of our appreciation for Professor Pistor. Last but not least, I want to thank Mr. Joeri Vananroye of the Revue de Banque Commerciale Corporate Finance who took the initiative of inviting Professor Pistor. And of course, thank you all for your presence here, for your questions, and for your attention. And do not forget, at the entrance, the book is on sale. Thank you very much.